Good morning, everybody. Oh, thank you. That was okay, but we'll get better. My name's Kent. I am one of the co-directors of the Center on PBIS, and I get the privilege of making a couple announcements and then introducing our keynote speaker. So number one, I think some of you may have noticed some less than accurate closed captioning that happened during the keynote yesterday. So I want you to know three things. Number one, we are not changing the title of the Supporting and Responding to Behavior Guide to Selling These Girls Onions. It's not true. Number two, when we post Brandy's fantastic keynote, it will have accurate captioning. And then number three, we think we've got it at least 90% going here for today. So thank you for bearing with us with that. But speaking of today, I have the absolute honor to introduce Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons, who is Associate Director of the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center. She's got over 28 years of experience as a teacher, as an administrator, and a technical assistance provider around the country. One example of her work was leading the PBIS equity pilot for Michigan's MTSS Technical Assistance Center, which resulted in significant reductions in the discipline gap. But I actually want to share a brief story about how I met Ruthie. And I was sitting in the APBS conference. I was sitting in a session, and I got a text from Melanie Leverson, and she said, "You need to stop everything you are doing right now, and you need to come to this session I'm sitting in right now." And so I did that, and I went in and I sat, and it was Dr. Payno-Simmons sharing the results of her dissertation research on how to integrate PBIS and social justice frameworks. And it was life-changing. We instantly knew that we had to learn as much as we could from her. That started a wonderful opportunity for us to work together. She came and joined our Equity and Belonging work group and was a key member there. She became a center partner with a seat at the table. And I have learned so much from her, and I know that you all are going to learn so much from her this morning. So without further ado, Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How are you? Oh, there's water here. Great. Okay, Kent's making me cry before we even get started. I'm a very sensitive person, so I feel everything. It's good to see you, Dr. Goodman, over there. I just want to highlight that Dr. Goodman played a huge role in my growth as a principal, and as all the things that Kent was sharing. Steve, who was my previous boss, played a huge role in my life before we even knew each other. So I got to give a shout out to you, Steve. I appreciate you. All right, so I am excited to be back in Chicago with my fellow PBISers. I want to tell you thank you for everything that you do. You work hard every day to make a difference for students in our country, across the country, and often without being thanked. So I want to take time to say thank you for all that you do, and then also to highlight that I was most recently able to be a part of the Equity Strand sessions yesterday. And what was amazing to me was not only did this storytelling for social justice start in the keynote yesterday with our amazing Dr. Simonson, but also as we moved into those other strands, there were so many stories being told about social justice as it relates to putting systems in place to support all of our students. So I'm going to just continue that conversation today, and I hope as I continue the conversation today, you can see the ways in which you engage in different types of storytelling for social justice, so that if you're not aware of how you're doing that, you'll have some explicit language that you can use to connect with that. So the title of the session is Enhancing Positive and Supportive School Climate Through Storytelling for Social Justice, so let's get started. And All right, so this is one of my favorite quotes. I came across this quote a few years ago and I probably overuse it, but I cannot emphasize it enough. I agree with Atul Gawande when he says that making systems work is the task of our generation. All of the things that we're engaging in is all around making systems work. And I learned very early as a new principal years ago that it was important to work from a systems approach. And in doing that work, this quote really jives with me because I understand when systems are not in place, the support that you need to do your work, the support that students need, it's lacking, and that's where we see the outcomes that we see when they're not working right. So we have to make our systems work. But I'm also reminded as we make our systems work, they have to work for everyone, right? For all. And we know that as hard as we're still working to achieve that. And so I love this quote as well. And this is Coretta Scott King, and she says, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and you win it in every generation. So while we're working to make our systems work, we have to also understand that there's struggle in that, and we have to lean into that and embrace it, because for our generation, our task is to make sure systems are working for all of our students in ways where it's liberation for them. When they walk through our doors, they can be their authentic selves and they can engage in learning and not have to give up who they are in that process. Another quote that I really appreciate is from Edwards Deming. And he says that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. So we have to know that when we're engaging in this work, if we're getting certain outcomes, it is not our students. It is our systems. So what are we going to do to address those systems to make sure that all of our students can thrive? And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. So speaking of systems, what I appreciate about PBIS is that it has, implementing it and its framework has really impacted schooling in several ways. And you know, yesterday I saw a different iteration of what the triangle could be, and I loved it because it had a hug, and it had like, everything was within tier 1. And I just really appreciate it. But you can't have a conversation without at least having some type of representation of the triangle. So this is my representation. Just take a look at the impact that PBIS has had. Some of the positive outcomes associated with PBIS is what we're seeing in our own behaviors as adults, right? The changes in our practices, our behaviors, our beliefs, our ability to feel like we have what we need to do our work. And so there is an article that you can read or a brief that you can read that really kind of outlines what we mean when we say we're seeing changes in adult behaviors and practices. And I want to say that it is important that we start there. It is what we do that makes the difference. I like what my dear friend Kent Smith said yesterday in one of the sessions when he said, we didn't inherit the systems of inequities we're working so hard to address, but we have to be careful not to be complicit in them. And so as we change our behaviors and our practices, then what we begin to see is reduce practices that are harmful to children. And as a result of that, what we then begin to see are improved outcomes for our students. And so when we think about the work of PBIS, that's what it's all about. It's about changing what it is that we're doing, creating systems that are sustainable, that function to support all of our students and focus on what it is that we need to address within the system when something is not working well. Even though we know we have a tiered support system to make sure that we capture and support all of our students, we don't put our attention there first. So I have served in many roles. I was a teacher, my most favorite job ever. I was a principal, a district administrator, a TA provider. When I worked on my dissertation years ago, I had the opportunity to be a teacher educator, and I appreciated that work. I was able to kind of see the continuum. And now working at the state national level with TA, I'm learning so much. It never stops. The one thing I know for sure is that you are hardworking as educators. You work hard, you get up, you care about our students. People don't understand what we do. They think they do because they went through the system, but they don't understand. If we wore GoPro cameras for a while, people would really be surprised in terms of what it is that that is done every day. They don't understand, which is why it's important to say thank you for what you do. I know that we work hard. I know when I was in the classroom how hard I worked. I also know that even though we are working really hard, we continue to see persistent, disproportionate exclusionary practices across our country in which all of our schools are situated, right? And especially I don't know why it says bro, but for black and brown students, it's all right. You know what? I'm not aiming for perfection. I'm aiming for connection. So that's what I'm going to do. right? So anyway, we see this persistently for Black and brown students and students with disabilities, and we're even seeing it for other students that we may not be collecting the right type of data yet to understand, but we have to give attention to it. I can tell you from being a parent of Black male students and for being in education at the different levels, we also, in our best intention to support our students, can often unintentionally have lower expectations. So we have to engage in reflection what our worldview is, how we came to see that, and how it subconsciously makes us think about students in different types of ways. I also know that there is a difference across our country in terms of what Black and Indigenous, students of color, students with disabilities, and other minoritized identities access compared to white students. And so we have to begin to have a conversation about how did we get there. Understanding our history really helps with that. And then how do we disrupt that, right? So that the things that we're working hard to accomplish every day, that we're able to do it. And while we're doing that, we have to ask questions. What stories do we tell about the success that we see? Because sometimes we're getting success, but we don't fully understand the impact that that success is having if we haven't taken time to understand who our students are, how they show up, and are we asking them to be someone else to have the success that they need to have? We need to also ask about those disparate outcomes. What are the stories that we tell about them? Because they really impact what we do. Okay, what we say impacts what we do, what we say impacts what other people do. There are the stories that we are told, that from birth we're told, and we don't even know it. And it shapes our thinking without us really even knowing it. There are the stories that we tell, and sometimes we're telling the stories that were told to us and we don't know it, and it comes into the work that we're engaging in, and we have to be thoughtful about what stories we're telling. I constantly have to be thoughtful about what stories am I telling as I engage in this work. And then I have a really cool colleague. Her name is Kyron Obe-Ajayi. And you know, she reminded me recently that we also have to ask the question, are we asking students who they are? Are we asking them what they want to be? Or are we telling them who they are in our educational spaces? And that becomes important too. So I am a storyteller. That is the way that I learn. It's the way that I convey meaning, and I tell stories. I'm trying to learn not to tell too long of stories, but that's kind of what I've learned about myself, and I'm leaning into that at this point in my life. Leanne Bell has a framework that's called Storytelling for Social Justice, and when I first saw this framework, I felt like, wow, this is pretty powerful because it allows for us to understand the stories we tell, the stories that are told to us, and the impact that it has. So right now, I'm just going to introduce these 4 types of stories that Leanne Bell talks about, and then I'm going to tell you some stories about myself as a student, my experiences, some stories as a building principal, and then I'm going to try to categorize some of those stories and align them to the types of stories that Leanne Bell talks about in her framework. So the first story that she talks about are stock stories. The second one are concealed stories. The third one, resistance stories, and then emerging and transforming stories. In all the work that we're doing, these stories show up, whether we create them, whether we retell them, or whether they're told to us. And I have been in many places where I've seen these stories play out, and so have you. So we're going to talk about that. So whether you're getting ready, getting started, or getting better, storytelling for social justice can actually enhance your PBIS work and your systems, and it also can enhance what's happening in the classroom. So let me tell you about my story. I am a student who grew up in Detroit. I'm proud to be from Detroit. If you know anybody from Detroit, woohoo! We are proud. We're proud to be from Detroit. Being from Detroit made me who I am, and I'm just really thankful for that. But when I went to school, I was a child of the 70s. I came of age in the 80s, telling a little bit about my age there. Woo. Many of my teachers were white, and that was not a bad thing. It's just a reality. That's what it was, right? Many of the textbooks that I learned from, they really did spend a lot of time on white history and white culture, right, and historical accounts. When I did learn about people who looked like me, it was always the same 3 or 4 people, and it was once a year. That's my high school. One thing that I remember as I engage in this work and continue to learn on my own equity journey was that I had a counselor who really liked me and I liked her. But I remember asking her to have conversations with me and to help me think about what I would do after high school. I knew I wanted to go to college. I can tell you all that my family will tell you, all of them will tell you that from a child, I told them I was going to be a doctor. I don't know where that came from, but I told them I was going to be a doctor. And so I knew I needed to go to college for that. So I asked my counselor to help me, begin to prepare for that. And her response to me was, well, maybe you should do cosmetology. Maybe you should do something in Voc Tech. And there isn't anything wrong with that. I can slay some hair, y'all. I can do it. And I love it, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. So she really encouraged me not to even pursue college. And so that created a barrier for me, because then my coursework didn't necessarily prepare me for college. This was a person who I think loved her job, cared about students, but didn't understand that she took in a worldview, and then she actually shared that, or it impacted my experience and probably several other, okay? This is an example of a concealed story. These are the stories that are happening in the margins, right? These are the stories, when we get to stock stories, you'll see what I mean, that often aren't told when we're looking at data, when we're engaging in problem solving, when we're engaging in continuous improvement. These are the stories that we often miss. And so we have to begin to think about, how do these stories impact the outcome? Because these are conditions, right, of my experiences. All right, so what happened as a result of the things that I'm sharing with you about my experience as a student in the K-12 setting? These experiences really led to negative racial and gender identities, and the following set of questions that I asked quite a bit. I want you to know your students are asking questions. You all have questions. I want you to even think about, what were your questions when you were in the K-12 setting, and how did they change over time? And how did they get you to where you are today? Okay, because it really helps us to think about how our stories inform our lives and the stories that then our students tell and that are told to them. But I wondered, why didn't important figures in history look like me? I also wondered, did only a few people who look like me make important contributions? Don't y'all love my little chocolate face there? I should be pointing, right? And so I also wondered, what's wrong with black people? Okay, so this is a time in life where our identities are being formulated, right? And I was beginning to have very negative views about who I was as a girl, as a person who is black, and a person who lived in disinvested communities growing up. I also wondered what was wrong with me. So how can I excel and have strong mental and emotional well-being when I'm wrestling with these questions, because everything around me is telling me that I'm not important, I don't matter, and maybe I'm not even all right. Because a child of the 70s, when you turned the television on, I certainly didn't see people who looked like me. So these ideas were being reinforced in different areas in my life as well as in school. I knew I wanted to be a doctor, but I always wondered, would I even be able to go to college, and would I even graduate from high school? Sometimes those students who are receiving Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports are asking these same questions, and these are concealed stories that we need to understand so we can speak their language, leverage their funds of knowledge, and be able to create spaces that are asset. I even wondered if I would be successful as an adult. Even in high school, I was like, am I going to be successful as an adult? These were questions that I had. Again, these are examples of my concealed stories, that if someone had known that, how could they use that to actually support me to realize the vision and the dreams that I had for myself? So a very wise and beautiful woman once said right here on this stage that the classroom is the heart of our schools, and what our teachers do makes a tremendous difference when it comes to creating and sustaining a positive school impact. She also said, and I don't know why I didn't show up, but maybe I'm clicking the wrong way, but let's go back here. She also said, when we look at the basic things, right, that adults do in the classroom, they have a profound impact on the student. And I really appreciated hearing these comments, because it made me think about two teachers, and I had more than two that made a big difference, but I had two who really had transforming impacts on my life. And so I had two high school teachers that really made a difference when it mattered, I think most for me, at critical points in my life. One was Miss Cunningham. You know a teacher is awesome when you're in your 50s and you remember Gloria Cunningham. You remember the name, you remember everything about her. She was awesome. I had her in 9th grade as a classroom teacher, and I had her for drama. And it was the first time in a secondary setting that I had a woman who had the same identities, very similar identities as me. So I was just taken by Mrs. Cunningham. I wanted to be like her. I wanted to see her every day. She really did model for me what my possibilities were. So that made a huge difference. And when I finished 9th grade, I wanted to stay with her. So I took drama for 4 years so I could stay with her. Let me tell you, students, you know, they are honest. Children, young people, they're very honest, they're very real, and I stayed with her and I studied drama, and it was really awesome. That had an impact in my life too. But I remember one year, we were in the auditorium, and my friend Jerome had a bag of powdered donuts, and he offered me some donuts, and I ended up with the whole bag. And I loved powdered donuts in high school. So I'm eating the donuts up on stage, powders all over my face. I mean, I was such a, I don't know if it's a bad thing to say, but I was a tomboy back in the day. So I didn't care about a lot of things that I probably care about now in terms of appearance and things like that. I just really didn't care. But Mrs. Cunningham was in the back of the auditorium or the front, and she yelled, "Ruthie, that is rude. You don't take the whole bag when someone offers you a donut." And there I am with powder on my face. You know how babies' faces break down and start crying? That was me. It was like, and all of a sudden, powder on my face, tears, I'm crying, I was embarrassed. And so she asked me to stay after school. After school, she said, "I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, but I want to make sure that you know that it's important not to take the whole bag when someone," and I shared with her that I took the whole bag, number one, because Jerome said he didn't want them anymore. And number two, I had a brother and sister at home, a brother 6 years younger than me, and a sister 15 years younger than me, that my mom pretty much came home, gave her, and left. And there were periods of time when she was not there, and I had to become the parent while I was also a student. And so I was taking those donuts home so that they could have something to eat. When I told her that, her face started breaking down like mine had, and she teared up, and she became very active in my life. She engaged with me. She knew I loved skating. I am a roller skater, y'all. And she took me skating. She took me to the Eastern Market, which is this cool place you can shop in Eastern District in Detroit. And she taught me a lot about hygiene. She just came in and did things that was not even a part of her job description, but it saved my life. In the summer, she got me involved in the Attic Theater, and I was able to become a part of writing and producing plays and actually taking on really important parts, and it kept me busy in productive ways in the summer. So this woman really saved my life in many ways, and I love her. My second teacher that I want to talk about is Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis taught American history, and I can tell you in 5th grade, Mr. Lewis would always give these different side stories that weren't in the textbook about the contributions of black people. So he would be talking, and then he would say, "Did you know?" And he would tell something about what someone did. And for me, it was the first time I was hearing positive stuff about people who looked like me. And that changed my life. 5th hour, we would kind of leave. 6th hour, at the end of 5th hour, we would go to Burger King. So we talk about attendance rates. This particular teacher changed my attendance rates because I was in this class on the edge of my seat every day at 6th hour, waiting to learn more about people who look like me. And so it completely transformed my life because I learned things that I didn't know. And it started shifting how I was seeing myself and the questions that I had. I started hearing about a very different history from what I had in my K-12 or K-10 experience. For me, these were stories of resistance because I know my teacher taught something that wasn't a part of the curriculum. He moved beyond what he was told that he had to probably teach so that we could hear things about people who looked like us. And it really was transforming for me. So for me, that was a resistance story for him. And it also became a resistance story for me because it impacted how I taught when I moved to the classroom. It was also emerging and transforming because that new information shifted everything for me and changed my life. So as a result of Mr. Lewis, I went to Michigan State. Woo-hoo! Go green! Woo! I love it. MSU is in the house. All right, sorry for everybody else. It is what it is. But when I got to MSU, I was denied 3 times. And a girl in a disinvested community trying to figure this out. Application fees are not cheap. I had to pay $50 every time. Back then, that was a lot of money. The 3rd time, I just went up to his office, the person who signed my denial, and said, "Why are you denying me?" After he picked his mouth up off the floor, he said, no one has ever done this before. And he said, because even though you have a decent grade point average, when you're applying directly into the College of Education, it's highly competitive, and most of our students have 4.0s. And I just kind of put my hand on my hip, kind of was like, well, I had to raise my siblings. I've had a job since I was 12 years old. I've not had the luxury of just going to school. I know without a doubt that if I have the opportunity to come to the school, that I will be able to do what I need to do. He says, well, let me tell you what you need to do. And he told me what I needed to do. I applied into the College of Arts and Letters because I wanted to study history because Mr. Lewis inspired me. So I actually went in and did that and then got accepted, had to prove myself. Even when I got accepted, I was told at the registrar's office that I would most likely be unsuccessful. And I remember feeling like that makes me nervous because I want to be successful, but you're telling me based on what you're looking at that I'm not going to be. But I graduated at the top of my class with a 3.8. I earned my master's degree with a 4.0, and I earned my doctorate with a 3.93. Now I know these aren't probably the greatest, but I went back and told that person in the registrar's office, don't you ever tell somebody what they cannot do, because you see what I was able to do, right? Some people, you might shut them down when you do this. And I say this to you not to brag about myself, but this is what our children can do. This is what their possibilities are. Yesterday, Dr. Simonson said, imagine. And I really love that she started us off with imagining, because first we have to see it, and then we can work to actually move towards it and achieve it. So imagine all the children that you're working with, the ones that we sometimes feel like, will they be okay? This is what they can do. I had all the odds against many. I can't say all because I'm more aware now of what some of my privileges are, but I had so many odds against me. I shouldn't have been where I was. So a critical moment for me in undergrad was majoring in history. It opened my eyes to truths I did not know. I was empowered, and I started feeling more like maybe I am somebody, maybe I am okay, maybe I am important, maybe I do matter, because I learned about systems of oppression and how they situate and position us. I also learned that it was going to be important for me to go in my classroom and provide a different experience for my students. And so the things I learned is I didn't know that there were black people before the Mayflower. That was not taught in the history books that I had growing up. I did not know that women fought for their own rights and had their own struggle, because I don't recall getting these lessons in my history. I didn't know there was a Seneca Falls and that there was a declaration of sentiments where women were fighting for their rights, and that there was some crossing of racial lines to do that, even though there were still issues. I did not know that the first Republicans were like, that there were black Republicans. I'm like, whoa, like the stories we get told, we don't even know the truth sometimes because of the stories we're being told. These were stories of resistance for me because they were showing me how others resisted the systems of oppression and modeled for me the things that I could do, along with inspiration. So during and after teaching my teacher preparation, my questions started shifting. How are your questions or have your questions shifted as you've engaged in this work? From being a child to a student to a professional in this work. I started asking, how can I ensure that the students of all backgrounds see current and historical figures that look like them? How can I facilitate student learning that cultivates critical consciousness? Our students need to be able to critique and give feedback on the systems that they're in, and their voices need to be heard and leveraged to actually make changes that works for them. Pedro Noguera says in The Trouble with Boys is that we often do interventions, or the trouble with black boys, that we often do all this hard work creating interventions for students without asking them, what is it that they need? What's working for them and what's not? And let me tell you, they can tell you. And we have to be able to listen a lot of times. I wonder, how can I infuse multicultural literature across content area? And how can I help people interrogate their conceptions of black people? What's wrong with people and their thinking? And how did they get there? This is before I knew some of the things I know now. So these were the questions that I had. I needed to understand. You see the shift that's happening as a result of some of the experiences and some of the storytelling that shifted for me. I went from asking what was wrong with me, what's wrong with black people, to what's wrong with people and their thinking and how did it get there, right? And so wanting to know more about that. This is an article that talks about my first year of teaching, where I wanted to understand, how does a teacher teach for social justice? I opened my classroom up very early to researchers. I wanted to understand how to have practices that would make students want to be in school. And it talks about how I wanted my students' questions to lead the unit. And if we had more time, I'd tell, but I'm glad we have a timer here, and I got 29 minutes and a lot more to say. So if you want to check out the article, it's a pretty old article at this point, but it is very relevant to the work that we're doing today. But I can tell you that from day one in my classroom, my students negotiated the curriculum. They made decisions about the curriculum. They made decisions about the norms in the classroom, and they were co-facilitators of learning. And I learned in my internship very early that I needed to make sure I understood their funds of knowledge and not to silence them. I was not a perfect teacher. I made a lot of mistakes now that I know what I know, and I wish I can go back and change them, but these were things that I worked towards when I did the work. I feel like there are a lot of clicks, but again, it went really quick, but this is, again, an example of my resistance stories, because I'm actually working to push back on systems of oppression that shows up in our schools that we didn't create, we inherited, but we have to be careful not to become complicit to it. So what are my questions today? I'm now serving at a national Equity Assistance Center, and oh, I'm on a huge learning curve. All the stuff I thought I knew, I'm learning even more, and being challenged internally to check my own worldviews and how I've been conditioned to think about things. And I am growing, and it doesn't always feel good, but I've learned to lean into it. And I encourage you to lean into those uncomfortable spaces when we talk about how systems aren't necessarily working for everyone else, because through that struggle comes growth and expansion. And so I want you to know that. So how do I continue to interrogate my own biases, because I have them, I have them, and assumptions? How can I help TA providers, teachers, educators, administrators understand issues of bias? If I'm at the table in any conversation, I'm going to be lifting that up. And sometimes it's hard and it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. How can I ensure that all students have access to equitable educational opportunities? And how do I help educators and school communities interrogate their conceptions of Black people and other people from non-dominant identities? That is the work that I do, and I'm passionate about it. But I'm also learning, and these are my emerging stories, because these are the things that I do in the work that I do. So let's talk about storytelling for social justice. We talked about stock stories. Stock stories are a set of stories. They're typical, they have a long shelf life, they're canned, but they explain racial dynamics and other dynamics in ways that support maintaining the status quo. And they often affirm dominant groups' superiority while claiming equality. Right? And so in my story, some of the stock stories were, if you just work hard enough, you'll be prepared for college. If you get good grades, you will be prepared and you'll be college ready. Well, that was not true. It was not true, because the concealed stories that I shared with you were happening in the backdrop, pushed off to the margins, and it made it difficult. Even though I did display an amount of resilience and was able to get to college, I had to take a lot of prerequisites. I was one of those students who graduated with a lot of credits, because I had to take a lot of prerequisites in order to be prepared for the rigor of those college courses. So concealed stories are the stories that actually exist in emergence. They often are hidden by stock stories, and that's the case because they counter stock stories. And so in my case, I was not represented in the curriculum. I was told that I probably wouldn't do well in college. I took several prerequisite courses in college, and there were several other concealed stories there, but those are some of the examples. Resistance stories. They come from the formerly concealed stories because they show the large and small ways that people resist oppression. And in my case, my resistance was pushing through and excelling and doing my best to try to be successful. In my social studies teacher's case, talking and teaching about the everyday contributions of ordinary Black people really showed me some things that I did not know, which impacted what I was going to eventually do. And then the emerging stories are the news stories that we developed to counter stock stories. And it centers anti-racism, anti-oppression, and it catalyzes social change, right? So when we're engaging in our work, we need to be thinking about what are the stories that are being told, what are the stories that the data might even be telling, and how are we going to make sure we're looking at those concealed stories? How are we going to leverage what we've learned from other people's forms of resistance and our own to actually resist those stories? And what are the new stories we're going to tell in order to counter those stock stories that we've all inherited as well? So I majored in history as a way of emerging and transforming because I wanted to provide my students with a different experience than what I had. And then I leave for social justice, I do, but I'm also learning. I'm also part of making sure that I'm not complicit because I am sometimes in many ways, and so I have to be thoughtful about that. And I believe that it's important as a part of my transforming story to constantly critique myself and reflect on myself. I got feedback just recently about the way I was coming off. I could have either rejected it or did the tit for tat, well, and it was like I had to sit with it. And as I sat with it, I realized I needed to make some shifts in how I was presenting, that there was a gap between what my intent was but what I was actually doing. So this work is ongoing. Let's talk about stock stories, right? In the United States, stock stories are often built around concepts of individualism, meritocracy, and progress. And they tend to pass on unquestioned truths when repeated. When we don't have those concealed stories, those stock stories become the norm, and they go unquestioned as being the truth. And they show up in different ways. When I came into Midway, I noticed as I was walking towards to get my luggage, all of this beautiful mural around, I think, the Second World War, and I didn't see anyone who looked like me on it. And I'm like, so what are we saying? No one who looked like me fought in the war during that era? Those are stock stories. They create stock stories because they say that certain people weren't there. They didn't matter. They don't exist. Their stories don't matter. And that is very harmful. So we have to be thoughtful about that. So it shows up in different ways, in conversations, in textbooks, in speeches, in film. It shows up. In the 70s, constantly the stock story was showing the standard of beauty that many of us hurt ourselves trying to achieve, and it's not even real to begin with. So we have to be thoughtful about that. Beauty is very expansive. So examples of stock stories, right? America is a land of opportunity. Therefore, if someone doesn't succeed, it's their fault. How does that play out in our school settings when we're engaging in work? Everyone who works hard can achieve the American dream. Really? There are some concealed stories that would say something different that we have to surface. Therefore, if someone fails, they must be lazy. And I've heard this in school settings. Well, he's just lazy. Is he? What's his concealed story? Or what's her concealed story? What are their concealed stories, right? What is it that we need to make sure we're understanding? America has made a lot of progress in terms of race. Therefore, we don't need to be concerned about racism anymore. It is no longer a significant problem. I'm sorry, I'm black. I can tell you I experience microaggressions on a daily, almost from the time I get up to the time I go to bed. I'm just keeping it real, and they show up everywhere. I've also been the microaggressor, so I have to be thoughtful about that, right? All right, America is a colorblind society. Therefore, people of color should not be complaining about racism anymore. What are their concealed stories? Slavery happened a long time ago. Therefore, people today should not be blamed for the problems of racism, and it's not their responsibility to fix it. It's our responsibility to fix it. We may have inherited it, but don't we want to leave this world better than how we found it? Don't we want to leave our educational systems better than how we found them? In order to do that, we have to make sure we're thinking about the stories that we tell. Here are some examples of stock stories in educational spaces. During teaching and learning, a teacher highlights a student who excels in a challenging subject, attributing their success to personal efforts and determination. Well, this does happen, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Context matters. But this narrative reinforces the idea that anyone can succeed through hard work, suggesting that the lack of success among others is solely due to their own choices. That is not the case in many cases. So again, we need those concealed stories. We need to know what they are. We need to understand what those stories of resistance are. What does it look like in board meetings? Right? A school board member discusses overall improvement in test scores and across the demographics, framing that this is proof that the systems are equitable. Here's the challenge with that. The narrative promotes the notion that systemic inequities have been addressed, ignoring persistent gaps that affect marginalized groups. As a person who served as a principal, I experienced this firsthand. We were a high-achieving school, and I'll talk about that for a moment. And then I realized that I couldn't make that blanket statement because the new accountability system showed us that we had some really significant gaps that we needed to address. What does it look like when discussing discipline? When an administrator shares a success story of a student who improved their behavior after a brief intervention program. Well, that can happen, but we have to be careful to make sure that we are not reinforcing the belief that behavior issues are individual failings, downplaying systemic issues like implicit bias or and also disciplinary practices. So we have to be careful about the types of stories we're telling, and we have to make sure that if we're telling that particular story, we have to also tell the concealed story so we have a whole picture of what it was that this student was able to accomplish and what were the barriers in the system that made it difficult for the student to do so. During data review, a principal presents a narrative about the school's rising graduation rates, right, implying that all students are benefiting equally. This perspective obscures the reality of ongoing disparities among different racial and socioeconomic groups, framing the school as a model of equality. We know that this is ongoing work, so we have to be thoughtful about that. Student behavior in schools do not occur in vacuums, so we must continually ask, what are the conditions in which students are learning and teachers are teaching? Concealed stories often show up in the conditions that students are learning in and teachers are teaching in. If I had more time, I'd show some data on the conditions that teachers often have to work in. But I'm going to focus on the students today. So let's talk about access with regards to concealed stories. When we think about access to quality instruction, did you know that schools serving mostly students of color have lower quality or fewer resources than schools serving largely white populations, even within the same district? When we talk about access to advanced courses and GATE programs, did you know that students of color are less likely than their white peers to be enrolled in AP courses and gifted and talented programs? I was a building and district administrator for 10 years, and during that time, I remembered the top 10 across the 2 districts that I worked in, the students always looked the same. And I started thinking, as I was the one usually giving the acknowledgement and the award to the student, does anyone else in this auditorium see that this representation is off? These students deserve to be acknowledged, but what about the other students that deserve to be acknowledged? Are we saying that there aren't other students who are achieving high outcomes that deserve to be up here? 10 years of seeing the same thing, that is a systemic problem. With rigorous courses and work targeted at grade-appropriate standards, students of color in disinvested communities are less likely to receive grade-appropriate coursework that reflects higher-level cognitive demand. With regards to accurate and representative text and curriculum materials, most of our history books, all the way back in the 70s when I was a student, continue to romanticize the Europeans' experience while misrepresenting indigenous experiences and African experiences. And so how does that impact students? What are the concealed, these are again the concealed stories. Access to an experienced and stable teaching workforce. Schools serving primarily students of color are more likely to be taught by out-of-field and novice teachers, and it's not a bad thing, but why do we see such a huge disparity in terms of who's accessing what, right? And then access to related services and supports. Students of color are more likely to attend a school where you have school resource officers but not school counselors when you compare that to schools with white students. So I'm going to do this pretty quickly because of time, but I want you to know that when I served as a principal, that's how I first got started with PBIS. As a new principal, I was concerned about whether or not I'd be able to do a good job. That was important to me. And so I had amazing students, I had an amazing staff, and I had amazing family members that were part of the school community. We had math test scores that were 93%. It was a stock story, and I'll tell you why in a moment. We had reading test scores that were 98%. However, I saw consistent exclusionary practices for Black and brown students and students with disabilities, from students sitting on the floors in the hallways to sitting on the principal's bench to being sent to another classroom. They were being removed from their daily instruction. We had over 104 CST meetings in my first year as a principal. CST stands for Child Study, I got to look at it again, Child Study meetings, these are usually like precursors to IEPs. And I'm like, we have 98% in math and reading and 93 in math, and we have 104 child study. As a new principal, this was baffling to me. And there was a heavy use of deficit language and thinking about Black and brown students and students with disabilities. I had an EI program in my building. Students came to my building from the county for different reasons, and we also had a large number of students who were on an autism spectrum. So there was a lot of deficit language being used by very caring people who did not mean to do harm. So what happened while I was a principal is that we ended up going into the state of Michigan shifted the accountability system where we could no longer be seen as high performing if we had gaps. And so we had to begin to look at did we have gaps between our top and bottom performing students? And that really helped me to see that we had these stock stories of being high achieving, because while we had these high numbers, we had groups of students who were not necessarily having those outcomes. And do you want to know what those students look like that were in the bottom 30 performing? It was our Black and brown students and students with disabilities. So we had some work to do. I was appreciative of that shift in the accountability system because it made us actually think about what we were doing. And even before that happened, before I knew what RTI was, what PBIS was, what multi-tier systems of support was, I was asking my staff, how do we know that what we're doing is the reason why we're seeing those outcomes? What would happen if our demographics completely shifted? Would it change things? So when my special ed director came into my office and asked me if I was interested in writing a grant to receive support from the center formerly known as My Blissy, I do that so I don't trip over my tongue trying to say all the different letters in the center. I jumped at it because I needed to hold myself accountable, and I wanted our staff to be accountable to make sure what we were doing was having the impact on students. So there were opportunities by writing that grant. I'll talk about what I did really quickly. I'll talk about what my staff did, and I'll talk about the impact on adult and student outcomes. So the opportunities were that by writing this grant, and we did receive the grant, this is work that Dr. Goodman led in Michigan before I even knew who he was. I ended up being able to work with him much further down the road, but I remembered his name being on the grant. And when I finally got to meet him, I was like, oh boy, you're the reason why we did all these amazing things. But we got direct TA provision and deliverables that we could come back and actually operationalize, and we had support every step of the way. At least 3 years of training and coaching to do this work. We never did this walk by ourselves. We had someone walking side by side with us the entire time. We had financial supports because in the middle of this work, I learned that we had to adopt a core reading program because people were really not really feeling like they could teach reading. And so by engaging in this work, our regional agency actually supported us adopting core reading materials to make sure that at minimum, all of our teachers could teach the big ideas of reading. And then we had transformative change because we became a focus school instantly when the accountability changed because of that gap that we had. These were emerging and transforming stories because we were actually taking new information and starting to apply them. What did I do? I built consensus. I wanted to make sure I had 100% of my teachers on board. I wanted to make sure that they wanted to do this work because I did not want it to be done to them. So I did what I needed to do, brought people in to make sure that we had all of our questions answered, and then started coordinating TA services and support within our building with support from the district and with our regional agency. I aligned systems work to make sure that we weren't doing this over here and this over here. How do these all speak together? It became a part of a continuous improvement process, and everything that didn't align with it, we got rid of it. We didn't continue to do it. Reallocated resources within the building, which is always a challenging thing to do as a principal, but what that meant for us, because the staff really did commit to this work, was that I made sure there was time. Where I had influence, I used it. Let's reallocate our time to make sure you have time to meet in grade levels across grades, participate in PLCs, and do this work. Let's make sure we reallocate any budget items that lends itself to having the sub-support. And so this was written right into our school improvement process. I engaged in a lot of courageous conversations because even though I didn't know about the journey that I'm on now with equity, I knew when students were being treated in ways that was not human, and so I had to address those issues every time they came up. There was a time when I had to look at every behavior referral because we didn't have Swiss or all those other things at that point. And I remembered looking at how students the stories that were being told about them on those documents. And after investigating, seeing that it was nothing like the way that they were being portrayed and written up. So a lot of conversations, often had a Kleenex box on my table. I used it too. But often to pull those shades down, let's have a conversation about how we're treating someone else's child that they entrusted to us. And then we started in disaggregating data to really understand what was happening across our groups, and we really worked to address the outcome gaps by increasing opportunity and making sure we were focusing on adult behavior. These were our stories of resistance at our building. And they were also concealed because as we started disaggregating data, we started seeing more about those concealed stories that we didn't know about. What my staff did, they deeply engaged in the process. They took on leadership roles. They led SLT meetings, school improvement meetings, professional learning community meetings, grade level meetings. I mean, they really got into this work. And I knew it wasn't about me because it cannot be about a person when the contract hadn't been settled. And I would go into work at 5 because if you're a principal, you know you got to get there before anybody else if you want to get anything done, and you're usually the last one to leave. When I got to my building that one morning when the teachers they were saying we're not going to do any extra work until this contract is settled, the whole school improvement team was right there in the building waiting. They're like, don't tell anybody we're here. Oops, I'm telling. Because we need to do this work. And that's when I knew it wasn't about me anymore. It was never about me, but it was about the work and about our students. And they came in and did that work very privately and quietly to make sure that it didn't drop. And the love I have and had for that staff was amazing. They engaged in the professional learning, and they kept me honest. When I was moving too fast, they brought me back so we could move together, because that's an important part of this work. They implemented MTSS for behavior and academic, and what that meant for us was we were implementing positive behavior supports, but we're also focusing on reading. They actually set the standard for the district and led to district implementation of multi-tiered systems of support for academic and behavior. That work was literally done on their backs, and I have so much respect for them because I can tell you it was really hard work. They took on roles that they didn't get extra money for, and that they had to work longer hours to do, and I appreciated them for that. But that's why it's important to do district level implementation to make sure that you have the right allocation of resources to support the work. These were our resistance stories. These were also our emerging and transforming stories. So here's the impact. We saw changes in adult practices. We saw that first. There was an increased awareness about systemic inequities in our building. We went from focusing on blaming the child to looking at what it is that we do and what we were doing. And that wasn't overnight. That was a process. It was ongoing, but we started moving more in that direction. We started paying attention to what we were saying and how we were saying it and how that positioned students. All staff engaged in the continuous improvement process. We didn't have the same team for the 5 years that I was there. I wanted every staff member at some point to be a part of that team so they could understand that work and also their voices be represented in the decisions that were being made. We significantly decreased the number of child case studies from 104 through this work, and we moved towards deepening equity-focused learning for systems change. We saw changes in our practices and our policies. We changed our lunch schedule so that students could eat first and play, which completely changed the number of referrals that were coming in after lunch. Students were able to get right back to learning because they weren't waiting for me to process 10 different referrals and try to understand what was going on. We explicitly defined behavior expectations. We did bring our students in after the fact. If I could do this again, I would bring them in the beginning of it and have them be a part of the conversation. We engaged in data review and action planning ongoing, committed time to that, strengthened core practices in our PBIS implementation and also in our academic, and started disrupting the deficit ways in which adults were writing about, or staff was writing about students, and then established the least restrictive environment. By the time I left that job, our students who were in the EI program were in the classroom every day for most of the day. My teachers understood that they were reading teachers and that we didn't have one teacher that we were sending children to. We were able to use multi-tiered systems of support to actually support all of our students and to use grade level teaming and cross-grade level to support students who needed extra support or students who needed enrichment in that particular area. So these were really important things that we did, and these were our emerging and transforming stories. The impact on climate and student outcomes was that we saw, through monitoring the progress of our work, initial incremental increases in outcomes. We saw a decrease, and that was important because we didn't see it statewide yet, but over time we started seeing it. We went from being a focus school to a reward school in under 2 years by doing this work. We saw decreases in ODRs. We saw improvement in the school culture because students couldn't scapegoat other students, and neither could adults. We saw a decrease in referral of male students, students of color, and students with disabilities. I did not allow students to be on the hallway floors or the bench. So it was either a conversation with the student, most of the time it was a conversation with the staff, and then it was, we're gonna get this behavior in check, but this student is going to be in the classroom for the day. That's what they're here for. So I provided a lot of support for my staff. I didn't ask them to do things without giving them the support they needed. And when they told me where I was getting off and I needed to do better, I listened and I made my adjustments along the way. Again, our emerging stories. The overall impact was that we went from being a focus school to a reward school. And what that means is that we significantly decreased our gap between our top and bottom students performing on the state assessment. I'm not driven by state assessments. I love the period there because it's like, period. What do you say after that? But it drives things, so we had to show that growth in that way. Again, our emerging and transforming stories. So when we think about enhancing PBIS practices through storytelling and social justice, we want to make sure we're centering equity in that work. You can see the definition that's there, and I'm just going to highlight some things that are important. Policies, practices, and interactions and resources should be representative of and constructed by the people in the school community, so that those who are there are reflected in the decisions because the system is going to be set up to support them. And then you see 4 constructs: representation, access, meaningful participation, and high outcomes. Those are very important. If I'm not reflected in the system or in the curriculum, can I truly meaningfully participate? And so even though I was successful in my school experiences, it came at a great cost. There was so much assimilation. There was so much giving up of who I was in order to be successful. That is not what we want for our students because that impacts their well-being. So one of the ways we can address this is through storytelling, right? How do we let students tell their stories and families tell their stories and staff tell their stories about what's working, what's not working, and then to make those shifts? When we think about systems, we can develop systems that prioritize culturally sustaining practices. How are we leveraging funds of knowledge and people voices to create the systems that we want students to thrive in and staff to thrive in? How do we incorporate resistance and emerging stories into the teaming training so that we're learning about paying attention to those stories and creating counter stories to the things that we hear about why a student is doing well or not doing well? With regards to data, we want to focus on systemic inequities using equity metrics alongside disaggregated PBIS data. And we want to use concealed stories and resistance stories to provide context to any quantitative data that we're looking at so we can really see the underlying reason why the outcome is what it is. Now, I don't think I can do this in 3 minutes, so I'm going to be thoughtful about what I say next. When you're engaging in the 4-step problem-solving process, you want to be thoughtful about making sure that we don't start by defining the problem with finding the issue with the student or students. Because when we do that, that's what we then focus all of our subsequent work on. When we're analyzing outcome data, we don't want to say, what is it about our students that's contributing to their underperformance? When we're looking at strategies, we don't want to figure out how we're going to make the student better, because focusing on the student, not the systems, right? Instead, what we want to do is we want to be thoughtful about making sure that we focus on the systemic inequities that may be in our systems, because this is where the stock stories tend to start when we have these conversations. This is where the stock stories tend to grow, as you can see. This is where, when we continue to ask questions about the individual student, this is where the stock story takes root. And then this is where the stock stories get reified. And then before we know it, it is a stock story that prevails. Instead, what we want to do is we want to make sure we're focusing on continuous improvement with equity in mind. We want to examine how beliefs, policies, and practices impact student learning. We want to focus on reducing systemic barriers. We want to enhance equitable access to quality instruction and education for all of our students. We want to address any policy that might be harmful. Students not accessing AP is problematic if it's the same students. How are we disrupting that? Then we want to shift the focus from closing achievement gaps to increasing opportunity. This is a way to think about it, and I'll stop after I do this here. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we are looking at what are the inequities that are present in our systems by identifying the indicators of inequities. We want to look at who's benefiting from the way things are and who is not, and what is it that we want to establish to actually disrupt identified inequities and to address them. This is where we challenge stock stories. We also want to ask what systemic factors are contributing actually to the inequities that we're seeing. So again, we're looking at our practices and we're looking at systems. What are the barriers to all students that are being represented in, and do they have access to? Can they meaningfully participate? Are they all having positive outcomes? This is where we unearth concealed stories and draw from stories of resistance. We want to ask what changes when we're creating strategies do we need to make to policies and practices to our own dispositions to advance the new understanding and knowledge and skills to transform our systems for our students. Because this then is where we create emerging and transforming stories in the ways in which we talk about and do this work. And then we want to ask how effective are our practices and our systems, because remember, every system is perfectly designed to get the outcomes that it gets. These are metrics that can be used to support asking and answering those questions. You already have many of these at your fingertips, but what you want to do is make sure you're focusing on access, representation, meaningful participation, and positive outcomes. You want to make sure that when you look at the outcomes, that you start by looking at the inputs. And so you have this handout, you'll be able to leverage it, to look at it and see how are you using these. This is where the concealed stories lie, right in that particular space. And there are reflection questions that you can use to have your conversations as you're engaging in the work. And so finally, practices would include making sure that we integrate students' personal stories into classroom practices to enhance their social and emotional academic growth by resonating with their lived experiences. They need to see themselves reflected. And as we engage in looking at outcomes, when we see all of these different things here, we want to make sure that it's for all students. And I want to highlight as I close that this right here is the most important piece to me. If I can go through and have positive outcomes across all those areas, but I don't have a strong and positive sense of self, then we miss something really big. That is a really big part of this work. So I thank you. Please finish the evaluation and enjoy the rest of the session.
Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons, everybody. You have led us in seeking out those and challenging those stock stories, seeking out the concealed stories, and maybe most importantly, co-creating those transformative stories. And it was really wonderful. You've got 30 minutes of time here. Please use your team time to help take those lessons and build the systems our students need. We'll see you in half an hour in your sessions. Thank you.